The story I'm about to tell today has stood the test of time and still causes a pang in my heart, not just because of the cruelty of one man, but because of the number of people who looked at the absurdity and decided to treat it as something acceptable. When an injustice becomes known as the norm, evil no longer needs to raise its voice. It simply continues. The Mississippi sun burned mercilessly over the endless cotton fields of the Harrington Plantation. It was 1859, and that land stretched for leagues, a white empire built upon black bodies, sustained by whips, chains, and the enforced silence of hundreds of imprisoned souls. The plantation house stood in the center like a monument to cruelty, disguised as civilization. White columns, wide verandas, curtains of imported lace. But behind the elegant facade lived a man whose wickedness rivaled hell itself. Edward Harrington was 42 years old, with perfectly combed grey hair, impeccable suits, and a reputation that opened doors for him throughout the South. Notice this: monsters rarely present themselves as monsters. They come well-dressed, well-spoken, and with people willing to call cruelty tradition. Heir to a fortune built on the blood of generations, he ruled his estate with an iron fist in kid gloves. His icy blue eyes never showed doubt, only the absolute certainty of someone who always had the power to transform desires into orders, whims into reality. Widowed for 6 months, publicly grieving but indifferent in private, Edward was already planning his next move. In the stifling slave quarters surrounding the property, where the fetid air mingled with the smell of sweat and despair, lived Sarah, 12 years old. Her frail body, hardened by forced labor, her eyes too large for her thin face. Her cracked feet bled on the hot earth, her childish hands already calloused from picking cotton since she learned to walk. Sarah was born on that plantation, the daughter of Isaiah and Miriam Carter, but her father was sold when she was only 5, taken away in chains in a cart while she screamed until her voice gave out. Miriam died 2 years later, of fever and a broken heart. Sarah grew up an orphan, cared for by other enslaved women who tried to protect what little childhood she had left. It was on an August afternoon, while inspecting the fields, that Edward Harrington made his abominable decision. He saw Sarah carrying a basket of cotton, staggering under the weight, and something clicked in his twisted mind. Not love. Edward Harrington was incapable of love, not ordinary desire. It was something darker, sicker. It was the certainty that he could take whatever he wanted, make the unthinkable acceptable, use his position to commit the unforgivable, and still be called respectable. That same night, Edward summoned Reverend Silas Thompson, a man in a black cassock with an even darker conscience. The pastor arrived at the manor house with his prayer book and his unctuous smile, already accustomed to blessing the sins of the powerful in exchange for gold coins. In the living room, amidst Cuban cigars and French cognac, Edward laid out his plan. He would marry Sarah. It didn't matter that she was a child. It didn't matter that she was enslaved. It didn't matter that it was a crime against humanity and against God. Edward had money, power, and the arrogance of someone who had never been hindered from anything. Reverend Thompson hesitated for only a second, just long enough for Edward to place a thick envelope on the table. Inside, enough notes to silence any moral objection. And here's something I always say: when faith becomes an excuse to obey those in power, it's not faith, it's commerce. The Bible speaks of men who took younger wives, murmured the pastor, searching for justifications where there was only abomination. And she is your property after all. The law is on your side. Poisonous words, corrupted theology, religion prostituted in the name of profit. The news spread through the plantation like wildfire. The overseers laughed with sick complicity. The enslaved wept silently, knowing that any protest would be punished by death. The few neighboring white families who knew pretended not to understand, murmuring about different customs and southern traditions, anything to avoid admitting that they were witnessing an unspeakable horror. The entire society bowed to the will of Edward Harrington, transforming monster into master of ceremonies. What matters most in this situation is not just one man's decision, it's the chorus of silence surrounding him, because collective silence is what transforms horror into routine. But what Edward didn't know, what his arrogance prevented him from considering, was that news travels, that stories cross rivers and mountains, that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a man branded with hot irons had heard of the daughter he believed dead. Isaiah Carter, sold 7 years earlier to a plantation in Tennessee, had survived the impossible. He had escaped. He had joined other free men and fugitives. He had armed himself. He had waited. And when the wind brought him Sarah's name and the horror that awaited her, he mounted his horse and rode south with the fury of 100 storms. Edward Harrington scheduled the ceremony for a week later, enough time to prepare the feast that would disguise the crime. But while he chose imported wines and planned his banquet, he didn't notice the signs: restless horses on the horizon, distant torches in the night, the tense silence of the enslaved people whispering about justice coming from afar. The devil was planning his wedding, but the avenging angel was already on his way. The week leading up to the ceremony transformed the Harrington Plantation into a grotesque theater where tragedy masqueraded as a celebration. Edward ordered everything prepared with the pomp his position demanded, as if he were truly about to marry a lady of society, not drag a terrified child to the altar of his depravity. The contradictions were obscene: French lace to cover a crime, fine crystal to toast barbarity, hired musicians to drown out the sobs of the slave quarters. Sarah spent those days in a state of confusion and terror that no child should ever know. She didn't fully understand what was about to happen. Her innocence partially shielded her from the complete truth, but her body recognized the danger with animal instinct. She trembled without feeling cold, cried without tears, awoke screaming from nightmares where white hands pulled her into the darkness. The other enslaved women tried to console her with empty words because they had nothing more to offer. What do you say to a child walking to the slaughterhouse? Mary Washington, the oldest woman in the slave quarters, became Sarah's unofficial guardian during those terrible days. 60 years old and scarred all over, Mary had survived horrors that would drive strong men mad. She pulled Sarah into a dark corner of the slave quarters 3 days before the ceremony and spoke in a voice that was both gravel and tender. "Girl, listen to what I'm going to tell you and never forget it. You will survive, understand? Survive. No matter what happens, you put your mind elsewhere. You think of your mother in heaven. You think of the cotton fields gleaming under the moon. You think of anything but what's happening to your body. They can take your body, but your mind is yours. Stay alive, Sarah. That's all that matters now." This is hard to hear, but it's true. In cruel systems, sometimes the only possible resistance begins within the mind. And Mary is trying to save the girl in the only way she can. Those were harsh words for a child, but Mary knew that gentle lies wouldn't save Sarah from what was to come. The little girl hugged the old woman and wept silently, her thin shoulders trembling against Mary's chest, who stroked her tight curly hair while her own tears fell. Meanwhile, the big house was teeming with obscene preparations. Edward had hired extra cooks to prepare a feast: roast pork, stuffed chickens, pecan pies, bread puddings. He'd ordered port wine from New Orleans. He demanded that the silverware be polished until it gleamed. He had invited a dozen men from the local elite, farmers, lawyers, a judge, all willing to attend and legitimize with their presence what they knew to be unspeakable. Their wives, naturally, invented excuses to stay home. Even Southern hypocrisy had its limits when it came to personally witnessing certain abominations. Do you see the hypocrisy? They polished silver and served wine as if aesthetics could cleanse guilt. Reverend Thompson arrived 2 days earlier, settling into one of the guest rooms, rehearsing the words he would utter at the altar. He carried his Bible as a shield, quoting verses out of context to justify the unjustifiable. When one of the kitchen slaves spat in his food, he was whipped until the flesh split open. The man of God did not protest. After all, order and propriety needed to be maintained. The afternoon before the ceremony, Sarah was taken to the main house for the first time in her life. 2 overseers escorted her as if she could escape, though her feet could barely move from fear. The front door opened, and she entered a world she only knew from afar. Waxed wooden floors, mahogany furniture, red velvet curtains. But the beauty was a lie. The house smelled of mold and cruelty. They took her to a back room, where 3 domestic slaves awaited her with a bathtub, soap and clothes. The water was cold. No one had bothered to warm it. They undressed her hastily and shamefully, washed her childlike body with hands that silently begged forgiveness, combed her hair without tenderness, because tenderness would only make it more unbearable. One of them, Bessie, was only 15 years old and wept openly as she worked. Then they dressed her in a white dress that Edward had hastily made. Cheap cloth dyed white, not the Egyptian cotton his late wife had worn, but decent enough for the charade. The dress was too big, falling off Sarah's thin shoulders, but no one bothered to adjust it. She wasn't a bride, she was a sacrifice being prepared. When they finished, they placed Sarah in a chair and told her not to move until she was called. She sat there for hours, alone in that strange room, listening to sounds from the house, male laughter from the dining room, silverware clinking against plates, Reverend Thompson reciting prayers aloud. Terror grew in her stomach like something alive, rising up her throat, threatening to choke her. But outside, something else was growing. The plantation dogs began to howl at dusk, a sharp, restless sound that made the foremen grab their rifles. Horses stirred in the stables for no apparent reason. One of the guards swore he'd seen torches in the distance on the road coming from the north, but Edward ordered him to shut up. "Don't spoil my night with slave paranoia," he growled. And I like this detail because it's human. Before justice appears, the body feels. Fear changes the air. Animals notice. Even the silence becomes different. What Edward Harrington didn't know was that those torches weren't paranoia. They were a promise. They were Isaiah Carter and 120 armed men riding through the night, crossing rivers and forests, determined to arrive before the unthinkable happened. The storm was coming, and no locked door, no armed foreman, no unjust law could stop it. Sarah slept that night in the strange room, dressed in white, dreaming of the father she barely remembered. And somewhere in the darkness, that same father rode faster, begging God that he wouldn't arrive too late. The day dawned shrouded in heavy clouds, as if the sky itself refused to witness what was about to happen. Edward Harrington awoke contentedly, shaved carefully, and donned his best charcoal-grey suit. He checked his father's inherited pocket watch. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time set for the ceremony. Enough time for a leisurely lunch with his guests, cigars on the terrace, then the obscene ritual that would transform his morbid desire into a fait accompli. In the kitchen, the enslaved women prepared the final dishes in heavy silence. Their faces were masks of stone, but their hearts screamed. Some murmured prayers softly, pleading for divine intervention, knowing that God seemed deaf to the cries of the cotton fields. Others simply worked mechanically, cutting, seasoning, baking, because to resist meant to die, and dying would not save Sarah. In the back room, Sarah woke up with an upset stomach. She couldn't eat the porridge Bessie had brought. Her hands trembled so much that the spoon fell to the floor 3 times. "It'll pass quickly," Bessie lied, stroking the girl's face. "Close your eyes and think of good things." But what good things existed in that place? What happy memories could protect her from what was to come? At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guests began to arrive. 12 men from the local elite, all white, all complicit. They greeted each other with firm handshakes, smoked expensive cigars, drank imported whiskey, and carefully avoided mentioning the elephant in the room. The fact that they were about to witness a marriage between a 42-year-old man and a 12-year-old child. They talked about cotton prices, about politics, about the growing fear of slave revolts, about anything that would allow them to feign normalcy. Here you understand why I said it's not just about a villain. Respectable. People sat down, drank, talked, and decided not to see. 3 o'clock sharp. Reverend Thompson positioned himself in the main room, Bible in hand, wooden cross hanging around his neck. The guests settled into chairs arranged in rows. Edward stood at the front, a satisfied smile on his lips, hands clasped behind his back, and then Sarah was brought in. She entered escorted by 2 domestic slaves, so small in that loose white dress, so visibly terrified that even the hardest men averted their gaze. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor. Her eyes were glazed, her mind already beginning to disconnect as Mary had taught her. They placed her beside Edward, who looked at her as if admiring a new purchase, not a person, but an acquisition. The Reverend began. "Beloved brothers and sisters, we are gathered here." Empty words, prostituted liturgy, blasphemy recited in a solemn voice. Sarah wasn't listening. She was far away, thinking of her mother, of the father she barely remembered, of the fields under the full moon. Anywhere but there. "Edward Harrington, do you take Sarah as your wife?" The question was obscene. Edward answered in a firm voice, "I do." They didn't ask Sarah. After all, property has no voice. The Reverend continued, hurried, wanting to finish quickly. "Then by the power vested in me lies," someone in the slave quarters thought, "by the power of the devil, not of God. I now pronounce you husband and wife." There are times when the story holds its breath, because you realize that if no one interrupts, the world goes on as if nothing were absurd. Heavy silence. Edward leaned towards Sarah. She recoiled. He gripped her chin tightly, and it was at that exact moment that the world exploded. Boom! The sound of gunfire echoed like thunder. Then another and another. Shouts, the sound of splintering wood. The guests jumped from their chairs, some spilling their wine. Edward dropped Sarah and ran to the window. What he saw made him pale. Dozens of horsemen storming the property, torches lit, weapons drawn, determined faces. "Attack! We are under attack!" shouted a foreman before a bullet struck him. The foremen rushed to their posts, but they were only 12 against 120. The wooden fences were torn down in seconds. The armed men spread across the property with military precision. Some ran to the slave quarters, breaking locks and freeing people. Others surrounded the main house. The sound of chains being broken mingled with cries for freedom. And look how courage changes the landscape. The same place that seemed untouchable becomes fragile in seconds. Power, without consensus, collapses quickly. Edward's guests fled through the back door like rats, trampling each other in their haste to save their own skins. Reverend Thompson dropped his Bible to the floor and ran with them, cassock billowing, cross swaying, his entire theology exposed as a fraud in the face of danger. Only Edward remained paralyzed, watching his empire crumble. In the confusion, Sarah fell to the floor, curled up, protecting her head. Bessie pulled her behind a sofa. "Stay here, don't move!" The house trembled with the heavy footsteps of men bursting in, furniture being knocked over, glass shattering, and then a voice that cut through all the chaos. "Where is she? Where is my daughter?" Sarah lifted her head, her heart stopping. She knew that voice. It was impossible, but she knew it. From a long time ago, from before the sale, from when she still had a father. The door to the room where she was hiding was kicked open. Armed men entered, and before them, illuminated by torches, stood a black man of about 35 years old, with scars from branding irons on his chest, his eyes burning with fury and love at the same time. Isaiah Carter had returned from the impossible, and he had come to get his daughter. Isaiah Carter stopped in the doorway, chest heaving, rifle still smoking in his right hand, and for a moment time stood still. His eyes scanned the room until they found what they were looking for, a girl too small, dressed in white, huddled behind a sofa, her eyes wide with terror and impossible recognition. "Sarah?" Her voice broke as she said the name. "Sarah, my daughter?" The girl blinked, trembling. That face, marked, aged, but those eyes. She knew those eyes. "Father?" The word came out as a plea, as a prayer, as a question she didn't dare answer. Isaiah dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, outstretched with his arms. Sarah staggered to her feet and ran as she had never run in the fields, her legs weak and her heart pounding, running straight into the arms of the man who had sold her for dead 7 years before. He caught her and lifted her, pressing her to his chest, and they both wept with an intensity that tore the world apart. Years of separation, of pain, of nights of prayer, all culminating in that impossible embrace. This is the kind of scene that doesn't need exaggeration, because there's a simple truth here. A father's love transcends time, transcends distance, and becomes strength. "You're alive," Isaiah sobbed, kissing the top of her head, her cheeks, her forehead. "You've grown. You're so big. My girl, my baby. I came to get you. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry. Dad, I thought they said you were dead." Sarah clung to him like a shipwrecked person to a plank, her fingers digging into his shoulders, afraid that if she let go, he would disappear again. "Never, daughter. I never stopped looking for you. Never." The other men spread throughout the house, searching rooms, overpowering the few overseers who tried to resist. Outside, the slave quarters opened one by one, enslaved men and women staggering towards freedom with disbelief in their eyes, some running, others falling to their knees and crying, others just standing motionless, trying to process that the chains were broken. But one man was still at large. Edward Harrington had slipped down the back stairs, running to his office where he kept a pistol. His world was crumbling, his property invaded, his authority annihilated, his perversion interrupted. But he would not accept defeat without a fight. He found the gun in the drawer, loaded it with trembling hands, and it was at that moment that 2 men burst through the door. "Stay away from me!" Edward pointed the pistol, but his hands were shaking so much he could barely aim. "I am Edward Harrington. Do you know who I am? I own 500 people. I have friends in the government. They're going to hang you all for trespassing." "Property." Isaiah's voice came from the doorway. He had entered carrying Sarah in his arms, her face buried in his neck. He gently placed her in another man's hands. "Take her outside. This isn't for the child to see." Then he turned to Edward with eyes that were both judgment and sentence. "You talk about property. You talk about rights. But what about her rights?" Isaiah pointed to where Sarah had been taken. "She's 12 years old, you monster. 12. And you were going to... He couldn't finish the sentence, choked with rage. "I have legal rights. The law is on my side. It is my property as registered and this is where I want you to stop with me. When someone uses law to justify inhumanity, the law becomes a mask, and a mask doesn't transform wrong into right." "Shut your mouth!" Isaiah's shout echoed off the walls. "There's no law here today, only truth. And the truth is that you're a demon dressed in men's clothes." Edward tried to shoot, but his hands were shaking too much. The bullet hit the ceiling. Before he could reload, 2 men disarmed him and violently pushed him against the wall. He fell, tried to get up, and was pushed again. His arrogance melted away, revealing the coward beneath. "Please, I have money, gold. I can pay you." Dignity vanished, replaced by please. "Take whatever you want, take everything. Just let me live." Isaiah picked up a chain from the floor, one of the chains Edward used on his slaves, and swung it slowly. The metal clashed against metal, an ominous sound. "Do you know how many times I was chained up? Do you know how many times they beat me with that?" Isaiah walked slowly around Edward, who cowered on the ground. "I endured 7 years. 7 years being sold, bought, branded like cattle. 7 years dreaming of the day I would return to get my daughter, and when I finally find out where she is, I also find out what you plan to do with her." "I didn't do anything! I didn't do anything!" Edward pleaded now, tears streaming down his face. "By luck, by sheer luck, we arrived in time, but you were going to. You were going to destroy a child because you thought your money gave you the right, because you thought white skin is armor against consequences." Outside, the plantation was transforming. The whipping post where dozens had been lashed was being burned. Property documents turned to ashes. Chains were piled into a heap that crackled under the fire. Freed people hugged each other, cried, laughed, not yet knowing where to go, but knowing they wouldn't stay there. Inside the office, Edward Harrington faced something he had never experienced before. Justice without law, truth without protection, consequence without escape. The men dragged him outside to the central courtyard, where dozens of people he had tortured were gathered. They forced him to kneel in the same place where he made others kneel to be punished. Mary Washington came forward, the old woman who had cared for Sarah, who had survived 60 years of horror. She looked Edward in the eyes and spat in his face. "This is for my daughter, whom you sold far away from me." Another one stepped forward. "This is for my brother, whom you whipped to death." Another one. "For my father who died on his trunk." One by one they spoke their truths. There was no theatrics, no spectacle, only testimony. And Edward, always protected by position and power, heard for the first time the true cost of his empire. This is justice in a way that rarely appears in stories. It's not a spectacle. It's truth spoken aloud. And for those who have always lived protected, hearing the truth is the first punishment. What happened next? History doesn't record in detail. Some say Isaiah Carter administered justice with his own hands. Others say he let Edward live, but forever scarred, expelled from the society that protected him. What is known for sure is that when the sun rose the next day, Edward Harrington no longer ruled anything, and hundreds of people walked freely along the road that led away from that cursed place. The light of dawn found the Harrington Plantation as silent as a cemetery. The main house had its windows broken, doors ripped from their hinges, furniture overturned. The wind blew through the empty rooms carrying ashes of burned documents. Property deeds that were no longer worth anything, contracts for the purchase and sale of human beings turned to smoke, records of an atrocity finally stopped. In the old slave quarters, there was no one left. The chains lay on the floor, open. The locks were broken. The narrow beds of raw planks, where hundreds had slept in anguish for generations, were now empty. Only the wind moved through those spaces, a ghostly whisper of what had happened there and of what would never happen again. In the central courtyard, Sarah sat on a stone, wrapped in a heavy blanket someone had brought. Her hands held a piece of warm bread, the first fresh bread she had eaten in years, perhaps in her entire life. Beside her, in a pewter mug, was warm milk with honey. Food of free people, food offered with affection, not thrown away like animal feed. Isaiah knelt before her, watching her every movement, as if he needed to memorize everything, the way she chewed slowly, how her fingers gripped the blanket, how her eyes still held shadows he wished he could erase. He reached out and gently touched her hair. Someone had carefully combed it, undoing the knots, freeing the curls. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're leaving here today, forever." You're never coming back to this place, never. She looked at him with wide eyes, still processing everything. Where are we going? To the north. There are people there who help people like us. There are safe houses, there are communities. We'll find a place to start over, and this time no one will take you away from me. Never again. And Mary? And Bessie? And everyone else? Isaiah smiled, squeezing her hand. They're coming with us. Anyone who wants to come, we'll travel together. We'll protect each other. As the sun rose on the horizon, painting the sky gold and pink, the group organized itself. 120 armed men who had come for the rescue now protected nearly 300 liberated people, men, women, children, the elderly. Some had shoes, others went barefoot. Some carried makeshift bundles of their meager possessions. Others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. But they all shared one thing. They were free. Mary Washington walked over to Sarah and held something out, a small rag doll she had made herself years ago. I saved this for you. I thought you might want it. Sarah picked up the doll and hugged it to her chest, tears streaming down her face silently. Thank you, Mary, for everything. The old woman stroked her face. You will live, girl. You will grow. You will be happy. I prophesy it. Before leaving, Isaiah left one last message. In the ruins of Edward's office, he hung a handwritten plaque. Freedom has arrived here. May no soul ever again be chained on this earth. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The march began at noon. Nearly 400 people climbed the dirt road that cut through the cotton fields. The armed men formed a perimeter, but there was no pursuit. The few whites who remained were too busy fleeing or hiding to organize a reaction. Sarah walked beside her father, hand in his, glancing back now and then to see the big house shrinking in the distance. Bessie walked on the other side, humming softly a song her grandmother had taught her. Mary followed behind, leaning on a walking stick, but with a firm step. They were a human river flowing towards freedom. It took weeks of travel. They crossed the Mississippi under cover of night, aided by abolitionists who operated clandestine routes. They passed abandoned farms where they camped. They shared food, sang around campfires, told stories. Sarah listened with wide eyes, stories of Africa that Mary knew, stories of escape that the men had lived, stories of hope that they all carried. On certain nights she would wake up screaming, reliving the room, the white dress, Edward's hands. Isaiah held her, rocked her gently, murmured, "It's over. You're safe. I'm here." And little by little, the monster in her nightmares diminished. They arrived at a free community in Ohio 7 weeks after leaving Mississippi. A cluster of simple but dignified houses, cultivated gardens, children playing, people laughing, black people living without fear, without chains, without masters. When Isaiah and Sarah entered the small village, they were greeted with hugs, hot food, clean blankets. "Welcome," said an elderly woman with a kind face. "Welcome home." Sarah looked around. Real houses, not slave quarters. Real food, not leftovers. Real people, not property. And for the first time in her memory, something inside her calmed. In the years that followed, Sarah grew up. She learned to read with abolitionist missionaries. She helped in the community garden. She made friends. She played Ring Around the Rosie like any other child. The scars didn't disappear. Some things never do. But she learned to live with them, not to let them define her whole being. At 18, Sarah Carter became a teacher, teaching other freed children to read and write. At 23, she married a good man who treated her with respect. She had 3 children raised in freedom who never knew chains. Isaiah lived to be 60, long enough to see grandchildren playing in the garden of the house he built with his own hands. On his deathbed, Sarah held his hand and said, "Thank you for coming to get me. Thank you for not giving up." He smiled, his eyes shining. "I made a promise the day they took you from me, that I would come back. Promises matter, Sarah, especially the ones we make to those we love." Decades later, now old, Sarah recounted her story to great-grandchildren gathered around the fireplace. "There was a time," she said, "when bad people thought they could do whatever they wanted. But a day came when good men said, 'Enough.' Freedom came late for many people, too late for some. But it came, and when it came, it changed everything." And each child who listened grew up knowing that justice, however long it takes, eventually reaches even the darkest places. That paternal love can span years and miles, that no chain is strong enough to bind the human spirit forever. The Harrington Plantation eventually rotted and collapsed, swallowed by vegetation, reduced to ruins. But Sarah Carter lived to be 87 years old, surrounded by family, respected in the community, free until her last breath. Freedom came late. But it came. If this story hurt you deeply, it's because it reveals something that still exists today. Evil doesn't depend solely on those who commit it. It depends on those who remain silent. And perhaps the most difficult question is, if you had been there, would you have been part of the silence, nor part of the interruption?